I think the cool thing about The Curse of Frankenstein is that it manages to be one of the more fascinating character studies of the character Victor Frankenstein, because it is so lax about maintaining adherence to Shelley's original story. Like the fact that it's willing to play around with this, and I think the primary motivating factor being budget is what makes this movie so fascinating.
So instead of making it a movie where the monster is the monster, The Curse of Frankenstein is the only Frankenstein movie I know of where Frankenstein himself is the monster.
That probably provides the best answer to the age-old conundrum of, like, do we just call the monster Frankenstein? Are we hacks at this point for bringing that up? I mean,
as far as The Curse of Frankenstein is concerned, this is the one time where you can call the monster Frankenstein. Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision.
GenreVision is a weekly movie club where we discuss horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more.
And we are kicking off another one of our patented theme months that we're calling Hammer My Heart, because we are going deep into the world of Hammer horror, which is going to be a first for both Travis and I in a lot of instances. And we're going to kick things off with Hammer's very first color movie, The Curse of Frankenstein. I think this is the movie we have to start off with because it's not only the very first color movie for Hammer, it was really the start of crafting their identity as the new home for horror.
This is a turning point in their sort of catalog of films. They had made horror films previously, and they were even making the, freshly minted X certificate horror films before, with things like the Quatermass Experiment, with Experiment, spelled with the X and not the E. They had been doing that for some time and kind of pushing boundaries, but this was when they really hit on their kind of like an assembly line for X-rated color horror movies that, were frequently, directed by Terrence Fisher, starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. And that is that, like, Curse of Frankenstein is like the first one of those films. And it served as sort of the model, the mold, if you will, for films in, further down the line with The Mummy and Dracula and so on and so forth.
It is no hyperbole to call this the progenitor of Hammer horror. Curse of Frankenstein is the original, and we felt that we had to kick things off with it. And this is such a unique approach to the Frankenstein story. There is a credit that says it's based on the novel by Mary Shelley, but right from the get-go, if you have any kind of familiarity with the source material, or even just in previous adaptations, primarily the Universal horror version, Curse of Frankenstein's doing things real different.
It is, and it's actually doing things that are pretty usual for the time. Like, it was really, really common that horror movies or science fiction movies had these sort of wraparound scenes in this era where they'd start with the hero in prison or talking to somebody, and this was kind of spawned from like old kinds of horror fiction, which were often, like, if you imagine a lot of Lovecraft stories, the first scene is like, "Dear reader, I'm going to tell you of something horrible that happened to me and that I've seen in the cornfield." It's that kind of stuff. And so the first couple of scenes we get in Curse of Frankenstein, it's Peter Cushing, and he's got a fake beard on, and he's thrown away in a jail somewhere in Germany. And he's greeted by a priest, and I think it's one of the guys that's one of the jailers there, and he's telling this story to the priest of the most horrible thing that happened. You have to believe me, and that is our wraparound. And we know that eventually the story is going to get back to that, but there's a whole lot of horror that has to happen first.
Even before all that, I think there's a very key thing that we're skipping over, which is that this movie has an intro card that sets us up. And it talks about people have known the horrible experiments of the name Frankenstein. It's, what I like about this opening text is that it is setting a very important precedent for this take. This take is going to be about Frankenstein. Now, you'll probably say, well, all Frankenstein things are about the doctor. But Hammer does something here that is very unique, and I don't even know if it's really been replicated, or it certainly hasn't been successfully replicated, except maybe by them in their future Frankenstein movies, is that Frankenstein as the character is going to be both our protagonist and antagonist. he is a villain in this movie.
Sure. This is almost the mold that slasher movies would eventually take on, where it's like, yeah, Jason Voorhees is the quote unquote hero, the protagonist of the franchise. They'll come up with new fodder for him in every single movie to slash through, that he is the villain that acts as the sort of centerpiece for it all. You can't make a new Friday the 13th film without Jason Voorhees today. Even though there's really, just the ghost of Jason, not literal ghost, but there's stuff with Jason barely in that first movie. This is the Jason Voorhees of this series, because there's a bunch of Frankenstein movies that star Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein. This is a reinvention, not only that it only, I shouldn't say it only focuses, but it really focuses on being a character study of him. There is a monster. There is a monster in this movie played by Christopher Lee, and he's only in a handful of scenes. So if you're expecting this to be a monster movie where it's a lot of Christopher Lee stalking around as a monster, this ain't it, Chief. This is something different, where it's a character study of a total psychopath. And there's a lot of class commentary baked into it that we'll get into, but it doesn't go anywhere, and it doesn't capture any, I think, modicum of success without Peter Cushing.
I mean, let's just get this right out the gate, because we're going to, the setup is basically that he's telling this priest his life story. So we see this doughy kid as young Victor Frankenstein, who you cannot convince me grows up to be Peter Cushing, but he's inherited his homestead. He's incredibly rich. He says that very pointedly.
Right. Both at the beginning of his story, both of his parents are dead. And so now he is the Baron. He has inherited that title, and he's inherited all his family's wealth. And his first step after, pretty much putting the lid on his mom's coffin is like, all right, well, I'm going to hire a tutor, and the tutor is going to teach me in science.
And it's essentially, he knows what he wants to do. Is he wants to be a scientist. He wants to do very particular experiments. He very quickly grows up to be Peter Cushing. And we're going to talk probably a lot about Peter Cushing throughout this episode, simply because I think about characters like Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, or Mads Mikkelsen as Hannibal Lecter, who have become such incredible figure pieces of their particular horror franchises. And unlike Jason or Michael Myers, they have cultivated a very unique and enjoyable personality, and that is a big reason why people keep coming back to them. I'd even say Chucky from the Child's Play series is another example, where people like this character as a character. Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein is so incredible at crafting a truly reprehensible, vile, despicable person that I could not take my eyes off of.
Sure. And there's also a lot of credit that needs to go to Jimmy Sangster, who is the credited screenwriter for this. And, the big take and the big swing to this being really more of a character study of Victor Frankenstein is motivated by budget. They didn't have a huge, Universal Studios sum of money to make this giant castle and, this, extensive monster movie, really revolutionary makeups and things like that. They didn't have that kind of money. And so it was sort of a stage drama that was set in drawing rooms and parlors and, corridors and, dinky laboratories. Like, it had to be that sort of thing.
Oh, don't demean the awesome laboratory set. I love this laboratory. I mean, I understand what you mean.
It's small. It's not this huge cavernous, like operatic, like expressionist thing. Like it's not that approach. It's actually way more down to earth.
But God, does it have character?
It absolutely does. We see a lot of really vivid use of color in that laboratory set. One of my favorite things about that is that use of color and that approach to color is immediately apparent in the opening title cards, where they use this really lurid blood red background. So it's like immediately they're like, oh yeah, we want you to fucking know this is going to be gnarly.
Oh, and it is. I mean, it certainly delivers on that promise. And I mean, yeah, of course, credit to Jimmy Sangster and whoever else, uncredited worked on the screenplay, because Peter Cushing is getting great lines to work with. And even though I will agree with you that the direction from Terrence Fisher is deliberately stagey, and I think at times that can be read as stuffy. I certainly see that that kind of read on it, even from my own personal take. But this is a movie that understands the value of close-ups and specific angles, and especially reveals. When we get to reveals, every reveal in this movie is like should be taught in schools. It's so good.
You know, the cinematographic approach to this is to let most scenes play out in wider shots than we're used to, and it's not a whole lot of shot reverse shot. It's very stagey, and I feel like that is not a negative about the movie. That's just something you have to get used to. If you're going to watch movies from the 50s, you better get used to them feeling stagey.
Well, and I think again, it's because this movie uses close-ups as weapons. It knows to, you know, like you're saying, a lot of dialogue scenes are just going to play in wide two shots. Like that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, but you got Peter Cushing doing we can't even possibly overstate how great he is in this movie. But then when the movie cuts to a close-up of Peter Cushing and he's going to say a line, like,
you know, the movie's going to deliver the goods in those moments. You just know.
It doesn't even need a line. When the first experiment that we see where Peter Cushing his tutor that he hired, Paul, played by Robert Urquhart, we see them, you know, growing up together and being a student and a teacher. Nothing queer going on here, y'all. And eventually we get to their first real experiment where they're trying to reanimate this dead dog, and they show us the process. I like that the movie doesn't get bogged down in specifics of how this all works. It just does. It's like, well, I know they got to pull that lever and they got to have something in a tank and they're going to pour some stuff in the tank. That's all we need to know.
Right. There's a lot of very colorful bongs in the laboratory. It looks like there's a big red tube over there with bubbling stuff in it. There's a big green tank over there with bubbling stuff in it. There's this blue spinny thing with bubbling stuff over there. That's just like, you know, crank up the bong. Let's go.
It's fantastic. But when they have performed their experiment, they've drained the tank with the dog in it, and Peter Cushing has to go up to it, and he puts this little kind of like, you know, amplifying device up to his ear to try and hear its heartbeat. And the extreme close-up on his face where he delivers no lines. He is just acting through his face. That's the first real close-up we get of Peter Cushing as Frankenstein. And it's the first moment you're like, when this movie goes into a close-up for Peter Cushing doing something, pay a fucking attention, because you're about to get a present.
He's got the perfect twinkle in that eye. Always. And to the point where the use of his eyes gets almost like to parody level. And there is a movie that eventually parodied this. There is this shot from this movie where he's holding up a magnifying glass and his eye is magnified in the shot. And it makes for a really funny scene transition in the movie because he has just stolen, or not stolen, but he's just procured a pair of eyes from the local charnel house. And in the next shot, he is looking in his big eye through the magnifying glass. And if you've seen the movie Top Secret, and you definitely should, there is a gag in Top Secret that is specifically designed to parody that moment from Curse of Frankenstein, where Peter Cushing, a much older Peter Cushing, is looking through a magnifying glass, and then he takes the magnifying glass down, and you see that they've just put a really big rubber eye on his face. It's the scene that's all backwards in the bookstore. It's great shit. Anyway,
well, there is this relationship between Victor and Paul, his tutor. I make a joke about nothing queer going on. That's because this is very queer coded. Not just in Cushing's acting choices, but in the script. It's very clear that these two are toiling away in a laboratory that they keep behind a locked door that nobody else in the household is allowed to, come into.
I've hired a man to come have experiments with me. There's a bit of that going on, but it's nowhere near as queer coded as, like, say, anything Vincent Price would have done. I would not say that, Peter Cushing's performance is particularly effeminate.
Oh, it's never camp.
It's effete, but it's not effeminate.
And I can only say this for this entry in the series. It never boils over into camp territory. Part of the reason Cushing is fucking killing it is because his conviction to the character, it radiates off the screen. He takes this character extremely seriously. That's not to say that the movie itself is just, a serious business, as I like to call it. There is a wonderful sense of gallows humor.
Oh yeah, really wicked. There is a moment where they get this dead body that was hanged, and they go snatch it away. And Peter Cushing's character cuts the head off the body. And, this isn't shown in really gory close-up. It's happening just out of frame. But just afterwards, sort of in an unthinking way, Frankenstein takes his bloody bare hand and wipes the blood away on his lapel on his very expensive looking suit.
Oh.
And it's such a brilliant little character moment that actually tells you what the character's priorities are. Like, yeah, I wear the nice suit, but like, this is what fascinates me to the point that I'm willing to just smear it all over my rich clothes.
I mean, that suit, this is the kind of things that I just don't see being a focal point in a lot of modern movies, mostly because a lot of modern movies aren't really trying to focus on these kinds of things with the way that they approach cinematic language. He has this coat and we see him wipe the blood on, and it's just very, callous and like, oh yeah, I just got to do this. That coat is always the coat he's wearing in the lab. So over the course of the movie, it gets dirtier and dirtier. It is symbolic of Frankenstein himself continuing to sully his own sense of morality as he just gets visibly nastier as the movie goes on.
It's also another kind of tip off that you're watching a really low budget movie.
Oh, sure.
That had to sort of think on it's had to sort of think ahead in terms of like, well, okay, we're going to have limited resources available to us. Maybe we can only afford one of this costume or two of this costume. We're going to have to figure out a way. They probably would have shot this in sequence, but they thought, well, we're going to have to figure out a way to get the most out of our very few British pounds that we're willing to pour into this. And the brilliance of it is the minimalist approach actually breeds a really strong take by making Victor Frankenstein this guy that's like really cooped up and insular. I actually think it really strengthens their take on him as a character. This is not a story about scale. It's not a story about the bigness of what's happening. It's a more intimate story. And that intimacy, I think, is one of the things that sort of sets it apart from the Universal stories, which are so often like just grand and operatic. And again, that's not a criticism of them. It's just how they are.
I definitely agree in that, like, Curse of Frankenstein, this is an argument for doing a new take on a character, because the Frankenstein story has been done countless times, before, certainly after this, but I can't think of another version that really took this particular route with it, possibly because once this had been done, people were like, you're never going to be able to top this. In that this is not a movie about the monster. Like you said, Christopher Lee does show up and eventually is the creature, as they call him in this. But this is a movie about Frankenstein as the villain. And in doing so, the movie knows that there has to be a consistent build to his villainous nature. Sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it's very large. One of them I like is, you bring up the idea of class commentary in this, and there is definitely class commentary going on in terms of the rich, particularly how Frankenstein represents the rich, in their complete disregard of the poor as even humans. When he gets the body of the hanged man that they're going to use for the base of the creature, he demeans the corpse's hands, because this guy was a highwayman, and when he has the corpse in there, he looks at his hand, he's just like, look at these giant hands. He had to be a thief with hands like these, or a gorilla. It's like, my God, yeah. Like, dude, like, you're like, Peter Cushing is so good at being a dick in this movie.
He's just so callous and nasty. And, this same sort of class commentary comes across in his interactions with the maid, with whom he's having some sort of illicit romance with, sort of behind the scenes. He's making out with the maid, and I feel like it's honestly like the most sexified we've seen Cushing, like being treated as like an object of a woman's lust. I think that was kind of an interesting thing.
It's awesome. I love it because, but again, the movie doesn't just rest on its laurels for it to be titillation. When we first discover, because there's a great cut there too, where Elizabeth, who is his cousin, he's been pretty much arranged to marry for a very long time,
right,
and is going to come and live with him. She's talking to Paul and is like, Victor's a great guy, like he loves me and all this stuff. Cut to Victor making out with the maid, and she's like, oh, Victor, and he's like, and she's like, Herr Baron, and he's like, that's right. like, call me Hair Bear. It's like, oh my God, this guy sucks, but he's so good.
That's another moment where we get like an incredible close up at the end of that sequence, and it makes for a really good scene transition. And then later on, again, coming back to that class commentary, he dumps her. Like he finds out she's pregnant, and he throws her the coldest diss in this movie. He basically says like, well, I mean, I could be the father, or, it could be any guy in the village, really. I was like, damn.
She's like, I'm pregnant. And he's like, well, who's the father? And she's like, of course it's you. He's like, oh, pick anybody in the village. It's like, whoa, dude. Like, he's such a prick, but Cushing plays it so well. It's the kind of villain that I think is my favorite type of villain that really, I don't know if wide audiences are really interested in anymore. He's somebody who likes being evil. Like he doesn't go again so far into being camp or anything, but there is hardly, if anything, redeemable about him. But Cushing loves relishing in being a wicked character.
Yeah. He's totally unrepentant, by the end. And, there are, again, a big handful of movies where Cushing comes back as this character, and they found this formula at Hammer where it's like, okay, Dr. Frankenstein has moved to a different village in Germany or Austria or Switzerland, and he's going under some really stupid pseudonym, like I'm Dr. Frank Victor.
Right.
And, he'll have some sort of, resurrection hijinks, like the last one they did was Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, where he's in prison, and they bring back this like really hulking, like ape looking psychopath
played by David Prowse.
There always some sort of variation on that, but they managed to find kind of a variety where there's like not every single one of the Frankenstein Hammer horror movies has to have a Frankenstein's monster in it.
No, I mean the monster in this is Frankenstein, and it's better for it. There's a moment where Paul as the experiment continues on, Paul is getting more and more like, you got to stop this. This can only lend to evil. And he makes a moralistic argument about robbing graves, where he's like, look, doctors are robbing graves because they're trying to advance science to benefit mankind, to find cures for things. You're doing this out of pure vanity. Like, you want to make this thing, and because it feeds your narcissism, your belief in your superiority over everybody else. And this is all like great thematic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then what might be my favorite, I don't know, it might be my favorite close-up, is Paul starts yelling at Victor, and he's like, they're talking about like, look, you got some hands from some guy that died. You've had to go get eyes, all this, but you still have to get a brain. And he's like, Victor, where is this brain going to come from? And they cut to Peter Cushing, who looks practically directly into the camera and just goes, I'll get it. And he has this tiny little smirk. It sent chills down my spine. It made me giggle with glee. It's amazing. It's amazing.
It's fantastic. And the next couple of scenes, they really build up this like, I know exactly where he's getting that brain. So they invite this like very renowned professor over to the Frankenstein home, and they're having this really interesting thematic, conversation in the parlor, out by the fireplace. And one of the big thematic statements of the movie is made by this professor. And he's like, the one thing that scientists need to realize that they're doing as immoral is like they abandon their discoveries and their creations too soon and try to move on to the next discovery. Like if they discover something, they need to foster it and make sure that it's used for good instead of just like discovering it and sort of carelessly moving on. And that's, that take is kind of, it certainly doesn't hold up under contemporary scrutiny, but it says something about Frankenstein's ambitions. And the more this professor talks, the more you realize, oh, Frankenstein's going to take this guy's brain out of his head and use it.
What I love about that scene, that's so fun. This is part of that. Like, this is a funny movie, y'all.
Yeah.
They give this guy just the most sympathetic setup as like, oh, he's this really nice old guy and he's very intelligent. And then he's like, oh, Victor's like, I'm going to take you to your room. And they're walking. He's just like,
allow me to accompany you up the stairs, Professor.
Yeah. So he's walking up the stairs. This old guy just takes us. It's like, oh, it's so great that you had me over. I'm so happy that I'm here. I live all alone and I don't have any family members with me. And you're so nice to me and all this. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah. And then Victor just goes, look out, Professor, and pushes him over the railing until he crashes on the floor below.
This setup's even better when he's like, I want you to come look at this painting right here. It's like right here, and it's right, in front of the banister.
Professor, look out!
And then just push this guy. It's so
don't lean on the railing. It's quite flimsy.
It's so funny, but again, it's like it may be obvious as hell, but goddamn, does it work? Because it's like. Because this is the first time that, okay, Frankenstein's willing to murder someone for his, he is crossing another moral line here.
Yeah.
And the setup is like, he can't just murder this guy. He has to murder the nicest old man in film history.
Yeah, well, he wants an intelligent brain for his monster, so he has another motive there. But then he goes out of his way to be like, I'm such a nice man that I'm going to take the professor, as beloved as he was, and bury him in my family crypt. And it's like, yeah, you're doing that just so you can steal the motherfucker's brain.
Yeah,
and of course,
exactly.
Paul knows this because Paul is the smartest person in the movie. And then he walks in on Frankenstein getting the brain out of this guy's skull. And again, like we've said, this is gory. We've said this is X-rated. This is X-rated for 1957. So you can't expect that it's going to be like really boundary pushing. It was boundary pushing for the time. But Frankenstein has the professor's brain in this like burlap sack because I don't know, it was old times. And he gets into a little tiff with Paul, and they end up smacking the brain like a stone wall.
No, he's got the brain in like a jar, and then he puts the jar in the sack.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because and then Paul's trying to get him. He's like, no, and then you hear the jar smash inside, and God, Peter Cushing's so fucking great in this movie.
He goes, my Tamagotchi.
Well, he almost starts weeping. He's like, if you've damaged it, it's like, it's the one time other than when he eventually has his life threatened where we really see him in a very weak state. Because the idea here, I think, is that Frankenstein is the ultimate spoiled rich kid. Mm-hmm. He never grew up. When we meet him as a kid and he's being a little shit, he never changed from that.
Right. Yeah. I think there's this subtext here that like little boys can be especially cruel. That little cruel kid that he was never grew up out of it. There was really no incentive for him to
he was fostered.
Learn to be good. Yeah.
Knowingly or unknowingly, Paul fostered that, believing that it was, a part of his education and pushing him into the sciences and stuff like that.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, Paul was on Victor's payroll.
That's true.
One of the things that, one of the first few things that Victor says, young Victor, when he's like 14 or whatever, says to Paul is, I'm quite rich.
Yeah, it's very direct. And again, I mean, that idea of class and money is established right away because Elizabeth's mother, who was apparently getting an allowance from Victor's mother when she was still alive, she's, like, oh, Vic, your mother, the first of Monday of every month. He's like, of course, I'll take care of it. Like, whatever. And the just brazen whateverness about money in this. But then there will be moments like when Victor goes to get the eyes from the charnel house, he's like, we said 10, right? And the charnel house guy's like, 10, 10 each. And then Victor's like, 10 for the pair. And then he sits there and counts out every coin. It's like, oh, it's so good.
So that is, again, I don't think the class commentary is something that the movie is trying to put directly into the text. I think it's more of a subtextual thing, but it's doing a great job at it. And I think this is something that has worked its way into the Frankenstein story through adaptations. This isn't a, villagers come and storm the castle Frankenstein story. It's not that. And it doesn't really show a lot of outside of the house, again, as it's sort of a budgetary thing, but it sort of wraps up in the insular world of the wealthy. It doesn't really give you this context that there are people living in poverty outside. There aren't poor villagers. But I think it reinforces this belief that, and I think something that really plays out to be true in real life is like, there are some people who live in poverty that view science as a weapon of the wealthy that they use to inflict pain upon lower class people. And, this has played out. I mean, this is the Japanese government torturing Chinese prisoners of war. This is internment camps. This is concentration camps. This is the Tuskegee experiments. Like, this narrative has played out in real time, or in real life rather, time and time again. Then you have seeing Victor as like playing God as a sacrilegious thing. And they don't often talk about that in this version, that, he doesn't have aspirations of playing God. But religion is viewed as like a shield that poor people will use against, what the rich will inflict upon them.
I don't think that's necessarily pushed in this iteration. I agree that
not as strongly, but it is there.
Yeah, but there isn't a whole lot of God talk, or that you're disgracing or desecrating God. It is actually one of the things I like about it the most is that it sticks mainly to a moralistic discussion of science itself. I like that there's a moment where Paul argues for grave robbing of the time. Mm-hmm. Like, he's like, look, yes, doctors have to rob graves right now, but they're doing, like, the reasons they're doing it are good. It is helping to progress things. What you're doing, he says specifically, can only lead to evil. And Victor makes the argument that, well, it's all about the brain. If you put an evil brain in there, then they're evil. But if you put a good brain, then it's good. Not realizing that this is also like a nature versus nurture thing, where it's like, yeah, but you're like the worst possible father for a creation.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, I think, inherent in the text, but this movie takes it to such a lurid and enjoyable degree. So when we do get to the creature, where Victor is trying to run the experiment by himself because Paul's like, I'm not helping you out. I'm bailing. And Victor's trying to run the apparatus, but it was built for two people. He's got to have his backdoor basement laboratory buddy to throw the switch.
I can't do it without you, pal.
Exactly.
You bring the unknown X factor into the laboratory. It's real magical when we make eye contact across the dead body.
So he goes up to Paul's bedroom and is like, I need you, Paul. Like, he says that straight, like, I need you.
Yeah.
Nothing queer.
Meanwhile, in the laboratory, Monster Mash is cranked to 11 and lightning strikes the castle. And this causes some like big energy jump in the electrical apparatus that's, running the whole shebang. And we see the telltale signs of this thing starting to wake up. It mirrors the dog resurrection scene from earlier. The monster is floating in this big tank full of some sort of fluid, and we slowly start to see the fluid drain out. And the monster is wrapped head to toe in bandages. It looks like a 6'5" mummy, because Christopher Lee was like 6'5". So we know Christopher Lee is about to spring out of this motherfucker at any moment.
But before he does, oh my God. So the fluid drains out, and we get this close up on just like the upper torso and head of the monster all wrapped up, and its chest starts heaving up and down. It's so like this, I think, was at the point during our screening where we both, you put it out there, but I think we both agreed, like, I think this is better than the Universal Frankenstein because this is also way creepier.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's playing a quieter build up to this. And I think the payoff after this buildup is tremendous, where Victor and Paul get to the door of the laboratory and they open it up and they see the monster standing right there, covered head to toe in bandages. And the camera does this sort of speed ramped push in, which is kind of uncommon for the time. It was really jarring to watch. And that jarring effect really heightened the scare. It was really successfully executed. Great scare. I can imagine people flipped when they saw this in 1957. And then there's another push in when Christopher Lee brings his hand up and rips the bandages off his face, and you see the makeup revealed in full for the first time. And it's an ugly makeup.
Like successfully ugly.
Correct.
Like it is a true hideous monster where one of its eyes is like cataract and discolored, and it's got all these slashes on its face. He's got black marks on his teeth and everything.
He's got a Beatles wig.
Yeah, I was gonna say he also has a very bad wig, but it's okay. Like it's endeared itself to me now. Like the more I visualize it in my brain, like I love this look for the creature. Lee, obviously, he's not being asked to do any lines or anything. He is just being a hulking beast. But I really, really like this version of the creature, because even more so than Karloff's version in the first film, I'm specifically talking about the first film here, Lee is playing this as a very threatening, scary monster, but he's also way more pitiful.
He is, there is a sadness in his expression that, I think Karloff, tried to go for that piteousness and that like almost childlike sweetness. Christopher Lee doesn't have that childlike sweetness in the role. There is a really pitiful adult sadness to this, and almost a hollowness. And it's after this that the monster escapes out into the countryside, and there is a scene. I think it's difficult to make an argument. I don't think the creature has any perspective scenes where it is the controlling perspective character in any one scene, because the perspective of the next scene that plays out is from the grandpa, the grandpa with the walking stick, and the young village boy. I think it's all from their perspective. So yeah, the monster doesn't really come across as any sort of significant perspective character at all. It's just a monster. They really don't do a lot to turn the monster into a character. So this is a Frankenstein movie, but not a monster film.
I mean, it certainly has the monster elements, because later when the creature escapes, Paul shoots it through the eye. Great bit of 1957 gore.
Yeah, this was one of the moments that really earned the X certificate.
Oh, it's wonderful. Christopher Lee has to reach up to his eye, and there's blood gushing out from between his fingers, and they've killed the monster. It's like, whoa, but there's still like 30 minutes left.
Yeah,
and so Frankenstein has told Paul, like, you know what, we'll bury the creature. They bury the creature right there. He's like, it's done. The deed is done. Wash your hands. We're all cool now. Of course not. Frankenstein goes back to his lab, and he walks through. There is an awesome, no musical sting or anything reveal, showing that Frankenstein has dug up the creature and he's hanging on like a meat hook or something up on the ceiling. And then you get another gangbusters, show me the money close up of Peter Cushing looking up at the monster going, "I'll give you life again." And it's like, oh, just can this whole movie be nothing but Peter Cushing close-ups, because everyone is such a winner.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you're asking for, it's like, I wish every shot could be a Peter Cushing close-up, but I think one of the reasons that those close-ups are so good is that they're used so strategically.
I'm being a little, I'm not even a little, I'm being a lot over dramatic in that, because yes, that is why I think the stagey approach actually works in the movie's favor, because when the movie decides to do something different with the camera work, you're going to get something good. We also need to talk about, and this is something that I don't think it's talked about enough for movies of a certain era. There is an excellent snappy edit on this movie.
Yeah, it's a short movie, so it's 83 minutes in total, but I was looking at the major plot beats as they were passing by and looking at the time going, oh wow, we're only this many minutes into the movie and we've already kind of hit this major plot beat. Like, it's moving along. It's got a good brevity to it. And so I think that prevents it from feeling too sort of stagey or stuffy. Good scene transitions, witty scene transitions, and a snappy edit. Just really liked that approach, and it never ever overstays its welcome in any scene. Nothing drags. And then shortly after, we see the re-dead Frankenstein's monster hanging from that beam on the ceiling. He's back, motherfucker. The maid, I think it is, the maid gets monstered. The monster just kills people in this one. There's really no like bones about it. It just kills people. And after Peter Cushing discovers that the monster has killed the maid, you can see this like really visible relief come over his face. Like, oh, thank God the monster got her.
Well, because she is threatened that she's going to go tell the authorities like what's going on. And there's this great scene of Frankenstein approaching her and looming over her and saying like, "What will you tell them?
Mm-hmm.
What do you know?" And it's like, oh, it's so menacing. And it's just like, oh, vivisect me.
Yeah. At this point, the monster has this hemorrhage in its right eye where it was shot. So it has this big black, Christopher Lee's wearing a big black lens over his right eye. It's real creepy looking.
Well, that's another reveal, is that we see that the monster's back and everything. But when the maid has to go into Frankenstein's laboratory to get some kind of evidence, because she wants to, screw him over because he promised that he was going to marry her. And he's like, I'm not going to marry you. What are you talking about? And so she goes into the lab, and we get this reveal of the monster's face close up on Christopher Lee, where it reveals that he has that black contact in now. And it's another just like, oh, that's so awesome.
Yeah. And they've given him a haircut. They've shaved half the head. So at least the haircut's improved from that fucking Beatles wig.
Well, yeah, because now the idea is that Frankenstein has lobotomized him to make him more obedient.
Yeah. Yeah. You did a really, really great comparison. You're like, oh, Romero definitely modeled some stuff in Day of the Dead on this, because there's a scene where Cushing is doing the whole like bub thing with his monster. And I was like, holy crap. Drew is so on point with that observation.
Well, he's like, stand, like come over here, stop. And then he's like, say hello, Aunt Alicia. So it's very clear. So much of this movie became a foundation for a lot of, I believe, filmmakers' love and approach to horror. And eventually, things go sour. Paul is going to go to the authorities and reveal everything. And Cushing is like, you can't do that because it'll implicate you and Elizabeth, who Paul clearly has romantic feelings for.
Yeah.
That he never outwardly expresses, but he continues to talk about, I stayed around here because Elizabeth's safety. I don't, trust her around you. And there's so many awesome little moments in the movie where Cushing, he puts on that devilish smirk of menace where Elizabeth's like, oh, Victor, I hope one day I'll be able to come into your laboratory and help you with your experiments. And he'll just stroke her chin like, perhaps you will, my dear. And it's like, oh, she's going to be parts.
Yeah. It really, really strongly stinks of foreshadowing, and wickedly delicious foreshadowing at that. So this movie, if you couldn't tell, is an utter horror classic. And if you haven't yet seen it and you like old monster movies, like this should be number one on your list, I think. It's historically significant. Probably not as historically significant as the Universal movies. I get that, but let's get away from the sort of America-centric view on this. Let's take a look at what was going on in Europe at the time, and this was a big hit. I think it made. Let's see. It says it made $8 million on a budget of like what would have been like $270,000 at the time. That is fucking enormous. So no wonder they kept making these movies at Hammer, and no wonder they kept repeating this formula. And this is a formula we're going to revisit next week too.
Yeah, I mean, they clearly had such huge success with Frankenstein that they said, hey, let's do that other one, Dracula. And we're doing that next week. Real quickly, we'll touch on the ending in which the creature is destroyed, falls into a vat of acid. So awesome.
Yeah, gnarly.
Which is set up from the beginning, because that's where like Frankenstein dumps the head that he chopped off of the original body, and he's like, oh, the acid will dissolve it. The plunge that Christopher Lee, or the stunt double takes into that vat of acid is so great,
because they're on fire at the time.
Yeah, there's a guy on fire in here in a movie in 1957. It's so awesome.
He dies like Rasputin. He gets shot, he gets lit on fire, he falls through a window into a vat of acid. That's what it takes.
But because during this whole last altercation, Frankenstein shot Elizabeth attempting to shoot the creature.
He's such a fucking asshole, this Victor Frankenstein.
Yep. So the townspeople and the authorities believe that Victor is the criminal here. There's no evidence of the monster because it's been completely dissolved by the acid. They find all of his experiments and stuff like that. And we're back to him in prison, and he's going to be taken to the guillotine. But Paul shows up, and Cushing's so awesome in this moment, because this is the only time really in the movie we see him totally unhinged and supplicating himself. Like he's begging. He's like, Paul, please, you have to tell him you can save me, Paul. And Paul's just like, nah,
get fucked, Four Eyes. Yeah, he really dumps him. And I was astonished at the final shot of the movie where Victor Frankenstein is being led to the guillotine, and the final shot is of the guillotine blade rising up as the final credits rise up. It's like, okay, all right, bold ending.
it rises with the credits, Travis. Like how awesomely, like that's so the perfect black humor note to go out on. But yes, it also is like, yeah, we're not gonna, I mean, I don't know if it was deliberately like set up that sequel, but it worked. Like they clearly had the ability to, not have to worry about when they got to the sequel. It's like, yeah, we left it vague enough that we can do whatever we want. The Curse of Frankenstein, this was the absolute perfect way to kick off Hammer My Heart month. It delivers on everything you want in terms of the era, like being boundary pushing for the era, a legit, like a star making turn for Peter Cushing. This was his first leading film role ever. Mm-hmm. Like, and if you only know him as Grand Moff Tarkin, you have to see Curse of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
It's necessary because he is just incredible. And it's clear that George Lucas was a big Hammer fan because he cast Peter Cushing and David Prowse. David Prowse is in a number of other Hammer horror films.
Yep.
Cushing is just electric here. And that's a very tried and true and boring way to talk about a performance from an actor. But it's true. He is so magnetic, and it's so clear that he's doing a great job because he is utterly reprehensible. There's nothing redeeming about this character other than it's really fun watching him be so evil.
Now, there are a lot of movies like this movie because this was so influential. And if you wanted to find other movies to kind of recommend that were similar to this movie, you would go to The Shelf. The Shelf is a collaborative thing that we do here with GenreVision. It's part of what makes us a movie club. Every week, we go to our shelves to pull a movie off to recommend or to substitute for today's subject film. If you want to get your shelf picks in, we strongly encourage that you do that. You can do it at GenreVision.com. Find the post for this episode and leave a comment in the comment section below. If you do, we will read your shelf picks on the very next episode. Drew, what are you pulling off the shelf today for Curse of Frankenstein?
Well, I try not to do this a lot, but I was really stumped because this movie, I really feel like it's in a league of its own. I had such a great time with this movie that I have to do an anti-shelf pick.
Oh.
We do these every once in a while where we say it's like these shelf picks can act as a good pairing or substitute. And when we talk about pairing, sometimes it's a pairing to better highlight what the main movie did. Mm. And I'm doing that this week because my anti-shelf pick is Victor Frankenstein, which I believe came out in 2015, maybe 16.
I believe
in 2015. This is starring James McAvoy and Daniel Radcliffe. This movie is cast great. The movie also has a really good take at the beginning. The idea is to make the main character really Igor, a character that does not come from the Mary Shelley source material that was invented in the third of the Universal movies, Son of Frankenstein, but is a very different character than what we actually think of as Igor, the yes master. Mm-hmm. There's characters like that in the Universal series. I think there's one in House of Frankenstein. But that idea of the Igor character is really an amalgamation of a lot of different characters throughout iterations of Frankenstein stories. And this movie was like, well, let's make Igor the main perspective character and make it be a buddy movie, essentially, about him being discovered by Frankenstein and befriending him as he goes off on his experiments. That is a great kickoff to doing something new with the Frankenstein story. And it's why I feel Victor Frankenstein is most being inspired by The Curse of Frankenstein and the other Hammer Frankenstein stories, where Frankenstein, or in this case, his assistant, is the real main character. It's not about the monster. The monster in Victor Frankenstein doesn't show up until the climax of the movie.
Right.
And there's some good stuff in Victor Frankenstein. There's a really fun zombie chimp moment where a zombie chimp runs about and stuff. And McAvoy and Radcliffe are really well cast. But man, this movie drops the ball at really rewarding you for its initial take. It's got some really dumb contemporary stuff too, where it's like somebody clearly watched Sherlock and was like, oh yeah, we got to put a bunch, like make Victor Frankenstein like Sherlock, where he sees things, like images that flash in his mind, and that's why he's a genius. Bleh. Like stupid stuff like that.
Thank you for reminding me to skip this movie.
Yeah, that's the thing is I'm telling you, don't watch Victor Frankenstein. There's good stuff in it. For example, like We learn that Igor's hunchback is actually a giant cyst, which Frankenstein then drains.
Yeah, I've read an earlier draft of the screenplay for this movie. This particular screenwriter, who we won't mention by name, often put his scripts out on the web, and so I've read an earlier version of this script from front to back, and I feel like I know the majority of what goes on in this, and I'm confident in skipping it.
Yeah, it's a bummer because when it was coming out, I was like, this is very clearly, unlike every other Frankenstein movie, which seems to be indebted to the Universal version, this is indebted to the Hammer version. No question about it. But it's such a misfire, a very disappointing one. But thankfully, you have The Curse of Frankenstein to watch, which is an excellent movie. Now, I hope, Travis, you have a shelf pick that you want people to see in opposition to mine. So what are you pulling off the shelf for The Curse of Frankenstein?
This is the adaptation of Jane Eyre, directed by Cary Fukunaga, starring Mia Wasikowska. This is something that I didn't think would be up my alley, and turns out was way my shit. It really leans into the spookier elements of the story. There are scenes in this that are like genuinely creepy, like really well executed sort of horror. This is based on Charlotte Bronte's novel and is fairly accurate to it. It's gorgeous. It's super moody. It's got a great score. The acting in it is wonderful. If you haven't yet seen it, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I will double down on that. A lot of the same things. Didn't think it was going to be my kind of thing. Turned out to be very much my thing. I really dig that movie.
It's a very creepy reveal. So I will leave it at that. If you've read the original story, I think you know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't read the original story, I would still recommend this. It's an excellent film.
Well, now let's head over to the listener shelf picks for last week's episode on Cliffhanger. And boy, oh boy, did you all show up. So we got to get through these. Thank you so much. Love having all these shelf picks. T-Bones McRonoke went with Speed. Eric Fuchs went with Daylight. I've not seen that. I have to put that on the list.
Same.
Mr. Milksteak went with my shelf pick as well, Die Hard 2, and an anti-shelf pick as well with Skyscraper, the Dwayne Johnson movie. DT Grizzler had Under Siege, one of the only watchable Steven Seagal movies. Eric Johnson went with The Italian Job, either the original or the remake. Sunner Campbell went with The Fugitive, good movie. And finally, Steven Espella had another Sly Stallone movie, Cobra. Because why not? It's Cobra.
All I know of Cobra is the time they clowned on it on How Did This Get Made. One of these days I'll actually end up watching it. Maybe we'll do it on the show. Who knows?
Yeah, I would. You don't have to convince me to do Cobra on the show.
All right, we'll do it one day.
One day. But thank you, everybody. Love having these listener shelf picks every week. Now we got to switch gears and do some calls to action. But stick around. We do have Currently Consuming coming up, where we're going to talk about a new release film, Synchronic, and some other stuff. So real quick, we are going to be playing a online trivia game called Final Exam next week. It's going to be Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. You can go to Final Exam Trivia on Twitter. They'll have a link there. They post the link to the game that day. And they're doing a special Valentine's Day lovers-themed horror thing. It's a horror trivia game that is run by some wonderful people in the horror community, Ted Gagan and Michael Gingold, who people know as a luminary in the horror journalism sphere. And we do it every time it comes up. It really is one of the most enjoyable things. And we want to invite all of you to come play Final Exam with us next week.
Yep. Again, that is Friday, February 12th at 10 p.m. Eastern. Go to at Final Exam Trivia on Twitter, and you will see the link there. We did a pre-show today. Pre-shows are something we do every week for our Patreon subscribers. If you want to hear what we talked about in the pre-show, I'll give you a hint. It's video games. Go to patreon.com/GenreVision, where you can sign up for our $5 a month premium subscriber tier. You will get the weekly pre-shows. You will get the monthly Currently Consumings. You will get FinFlix goodies as well, and other untold treasures, all for the low price of $5 a month.
And last but not least, if you like what we do here on GenreVision, rate and review the show on the Apple Podcast Store. It helps bump us up in the rankings and can get more eyeballs and earballs on the show. 2021 is a year where we're really pushing to grow GenreVision because we had a phenomenal 2020, and we think we can do even better this year. And honestly, we're going to need reviews to do that. So if you've not reviewed the show at this point, we are pretty much begging you to do so. And if you do leave a written review, we will feature it here on the show.
Okay, I think that's all for calls to action this week. Let's do some currently consuming.
Num 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 num.
Drew, what's been on your plate?
I watched the new movie Synchronic from, I'm going to mix up their first names.
Justin Benson.
Okay, it's Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead. They've made movies like The Endless, Spring, which we did an episode on, and still my favorite of theirs, Resolution, a movie I can never stop thinking about. Synchronic is probably their most accessible movie because they are art house. Don't make any mistake about it. They're art house guys, but they have a really, really unique approach to character that I think is able to cut through a lot of the arty trappings and kind of bells and whistles that will be immediately apparent to anybody who watches their movies. They're really, really good at character. And this movie, they got Anthony Mackie and Jamie Dornan as the lead characters. They're excellent. It's a really, really cool story that I don't know how much of I want to spoil. Suffice to say that it is a time travel movie. It's a very unique time travel movie because the method of time travel is a drug. I won't get into the specifics of how exactly that works because that's part of the revelation of the movie. They are doing some really exciting filmmaking things in this. There's a couple long takes and some really cool visual effects ideas that are still very low budget, but very thematically effective and very stylish. It's a wacky movie, but man, it works. It really works. It's still not my favorite of theirs, but if I was going to try and tempt people into getting into them as filmmakers and storytellers, this would probably be the movie I would use as a palette sampler.
How would people watch Synchronic if they wanted to watch it?
It is available to rent or buy on VOD right now. So do that.
It's in my rentals right now, I'll tell you that. And I will share my thoughts on it on a later date. Okay. Can I spring something on you? Unexpected?
Go for it.
It's time for a segment within a segment. This segment is called Too Fast, Too Curious. It's about what happens when your boy gets a little too curious about the Fast and Furious franchise and finally decides to start watching it. And I have watched, at this point, I've watched 3 of the Fast and the Furious movies. I've watched the original, I've watched the second one, and I've watched the 4th one. I'll talk about the 4th one at the later date.
Why did you skip? I know you're skipping 3 because you know that it comes later in the timeline of events, but
yes,
you shouldn't have skipped 3.
I mean, I'm not skipping it. I will see it. It's not like I'm declining to see the movie ever. So I'll get there. Anyway, one, it is kind of like the movie I was afraid it would be, where I was just like, yeah, it's competent at what it's trying to do. It's just not the sort of thing that interests me.
You're talking about the first one.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the first one. But Too Fast, Too Furious is the movie I was hoping the first one would be.
Yeah, buddy.
Because it's basically like, I compared it to listening to someone try to summarize the first film, but they've done a bunch of whippets. That's what watching Too Fast, Too Furious is like. It is so delightfully stupid and meat-headed and funny, like really funny. Mm-hmm. There are some moments in the third act of Too Fast, Too Furious that had me howling with laughter. It's so funny. I was really surprised at how much I enjoyed Too Fast, Too Furious. I'd watch it again right now.
I'd watch it with you. I loved it.
At this point, having only seen 3 movies in this franchise, this is by far my favorite, just because of how silly and how stupid it allows itself to be. I'm like, yes, this is what I wanted.
Well, and how vibrant. I remember that being the most colorful of all the movies. Like you sent me a screen cap of what's essentially like the main baddie's club lair, like, and you were like, what did you say specifically? You said it was like something if they shot it on the Austin Powers set.
It looks like they shot a scene from or like they tried to remake a scene from Only God Forgives on a set in the background of a set from Austin Powers. It's not just colorful, it's like Power Ranger colorful. It's like the first movie went on spring break and just lost a whole bunch of brain cells. It is way fun.
Harmony Korine's Fast and Furious.
What I wouldn't give for that. I mean, come on. Yeah, this is everything I wanted out of a movie like this. There is a really hilarious moment later on in the movie. I'm not spoiling a movie that came out in fucking 2003. there's a moment where Tyrese is driving somebody in a car near the end of the movie, and the other guy in the passenger seat is a henchman. And at this point, Tyrese knows he has to get the henchman out of the car. So Tyrese just grabs a button on a cable, looks over at the guy in the passenger seat, goes, "Ejectocito, cuz," and then slams his thumb down on the button, and the ejector seat wings the other guy out the passenger side door. It is fucking hysterical. There's a moment where Paul Walker gets bitten by the other henchman, and the exchange in that moment is just delightful. The screams, the look on Paul Walker's face, like this is operating at optimum stupid for me. It's Cole Hauser is the villain, and he's just the kind of actor I want to see in movies like this. Like he does such a great job being
Yes.
a dick in Pitch Black.
Yes.
James Remar plays the police chief in Miami, which is funny. It's like an alternate, Dexter universe.
Pre-Dexter, yeah.
Yeah. I was not expecting to enjoy Too Fast, Too Furious so much. Like I knew it was on HBO Max, and like, yeah, I'll take a chance on it. And if it sucks, I'll just bail. Could not bail. I could barely take my eyes off it. It's great.
I mean, I have seen it before, but it was when I did my big watch of the series, and it's the one that I remember. Like, I can't say I remember it the most because I watched a lot of movies, concurrently at that time. But it's the one I remember enjoying the most. I remember like this. I had pretty much the same reaction. It was like, this is what I want out of this. And I remember Tokyo Drift being not quite as hyper stupid, but on that same wavelength.
Yeah, I mean, there are some times when like a direct to DVD sequel to a movie is like, well, let's try to make the same movie as the first movie, but with less money. With this one, they were like, let's try to make a direct to DVD sequel, but give it way more money. That was what this movie's approach was, or at least it feels that way. And I really love that.
Put that on the fucking, that is the pull quote of the century right there, y'all. That's great.
Yeah, it's like the two guys that wrote it, Derek Haas and Michael Brandt. They're the guys that do like the Chicago Fire series. So they've grown into like really successful screenwriters, and this was their first feature script. And it really does feel like that was their whole approach. Like, yeah, let's write a really silly, stupid Miami sequel to the first movie. And then the execs at Universal were like, this is fantastic. You're getting so much, but you're getting $76 million to make this movie. So yeah. And that's all I have this week. I will return to Too Fast, Too Curious in a future episode. I'm going to talk about 4 and 5.
Nice.
So, one day.
Well, let's wrap things up with our
comment of the week.
And honestly, this was another week where it was an embarrassment of riches. Like that, it's one of the most active comment sections that we've had for an episode in a while on Cliffhanger. And as always, it bears repeating, we have the greatest comment section on the internet, which is a tough thing to claim because practically no comment section is a good comment section on the internet. But dang it, if y'all don't keep GenreVision's comment section a place we want to keep coming back to. Like it's wonderful. There were so many good comments, so many good, like I said, great shelf picks, great conversation about Cliffhanger and other movies. But I have to highlight this one from Mr. Milksteak because it's short, it's sweet, but it really encapsulates what we're trying to do here at GenreVision and what one of our big goals for GenreVision in 2021 is. And Mr. Milksteak just called us the best movie club ever. And I'm trying not to get a little emotional. I didn't think this was actually going to make me emotional, but that is so incredibly rewarding to hear because it's something that is, it wasn't like a direct intention when we started out doing this, but it's grown. It's organically grown into that on its own. And so much of that is because of you, loyal listeners, and this community that we've created, our little movie club. It's a movie club now.
Yeah, it's not a club without members, and anyone who listens is a member. We love the kind of engagement we get from the GenreVision Club members. We find it, one of the big reasons we go on and keep doing it every week. It's just so wonderful, and we're so glad that we can be the curators for members like you.
It's a space where people are just encouraging each other to watch movies, and it's greater than I could have imagined it could be. And we hope that we can continue that throughout the year, and we really want to make this the GenreVision Movie Club for y'all. So thank you so much, everybody. We'll be back next week to continue the Hammer My Heart theme month with We did Frankenstein. Now we got to do Dracula. It's Horror of Dracula, or just called Dracula in the UK. I'm very stoked for this one. And if we can have a repeat of the excellence we had with Curse of Frankenstein, then man, it's looking to be a good theme month. So we hope you'll be back with us next week. As always, we want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we will see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.